This is a video that's by popular request amongst many of the people who subscribe to my channel, especially the ones that have watched my reviews lately, on the Transition Smuggler, which is currently in my fleet as a demo bike. I'm going to explain the differences that I've noticed between these two bikes. Now, this will be more of a discussion video because I don't currently have the Stumpjumper in my fleet. The way I run my YouTube channel is I'll have either a personal bike that I buy or sometimes a demo, as in this case, that will be with me for a while. If it's mine, it's at least 6 months, usually a year. And I'll do a bunch of reviews and comparisons and things like that. So I don't have the Stumpjumper in my fleet anymore. So in this video, it's just me and Mr. Smuggler here. So we're going to discuss the differences. And I would say the biggest way I can describe the difference, and by the way, I'm talking about the regular Stumpjumper, not the Stumpjumper Evo. I've never ridden that bike. I actually may try to get my hands on that bike in the near future because looks like a really cool bike. But I'm talking about the regular Stumpjumper. I've had a couple of them. The latest one is the one that I like the most. It had a shorter fork offset, and just really like that bike. Really like the Smuggler. So let's talk about the differences. So the best way I can describe the difference from a high level, and then we're going to get into the details, is the Smuggler is designed more for descending. It is a better descending bike, and I'm going to explain why. First of all, in no particular order, we'll talk about the shock. So the regular Stumpjumper comes with an inline shock. The Smuggler comes with a piggyback reservoir shock. That allows for a shock that's going to be better performing over longer, rougher descents. An inline shock can work great until it starts to really get into rowdy territory, and where you're hitting a lot of hard consecutive bumps, it gets hot. It loses performance because you've got one piston doing all the work, whereas a piggyback reservoir, those duties are separated, and the shock just performs better, especially when the oil heats up. And on that Stumpjumper, I would get to the bottom of a descent and touch the shock, and it was warm to the touch. The piggyback reservoir shock does not get near as warm. It just is a better performing shock on rowdy descents. The second difference that we'll talk about is the actual suspension design. So the Smuggler has a horse link design, 4-bar design, so there's a pivot in the back. The Stumpjumper is a single pivot design. And it's kind of funny that we're saying that because Specialized really pioneered the horse link design, and now they're putting a single pivot on some of their bikes. Now the Evo does have a horse link, but I guess they figured the Stumpjumper, because it's not designed for quite as rowdy descents as the Evo version of the Stumpjumper, they didn't need a horse link. Now, there are some advantages to the single pivot, and that is the fact that there's less maintenance, it's simple. But more importantly, I noticed that it had a really springy, playful feel. So you're springing in and out of the corners a little bit more. And I like the feel of that. Now, the advantage of the horse link is the fact that you're just going to have more rear wheel traction. And if you don't have rear wheel traction, you don't have braking from the rear wheel. And so that's where the horse link really comes into play. So it just allows the rear tire to be glued to the trail a little bit more. I didn't really notice a huge difference, but I also didn't ride these bikes back to back on the exact same descent. From what I know about horse link designs, I know that you're going to have more rear wheel traction on this bike versus the Stumpjumper. The other thing that makes these bikes different in terms of descending is the geometry. So I'm going to go over some geometry numbers between these two bikes to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about. And first of all, I've mentioned this before with the Smuggler, is it has a pretty long front center. So the front center on the Smuggler is 780, and that's the distance between the bottom bracket and the front axle. And the Stumpjumper was still pretty long at 770, and that's one thing I really liked about the Stumpjumper versus some other bikes that I've ridden. So I like that Specialized puts on a longer front center, longer wheelbase, but it's just not quite as long as a Smuggler. Now, if you're wondering what that does, is it just makes for a more stable bike on rougher descents. It does make for a bike that's a little bit more sluggish, getting around tight switchbacks, going uphill, maybe feeling a little bit longer, more sluggish on cross-country trails. But when the descents get rowdy, the longer front center is going to help, and the Smuggler just has a bit longer one. The wheelbase on the Transition Smuggler, now I'm talking about mediums, so that's what I ride. Now, different bikes are going to have different you know, wheelbases and front centers, but the differences should be about the same proportion. So the wheelbase on the Smuggler on the medium is 1213 millimeters, 1200 on the Stumpjumper, a little bit longer on the Smuggler, a little bit more stable, but not a huge difference. And then also the bottom bracket drop is about the same if you run the Stumpjumper in the low position, 35 millimeters. And then finally the reach. The reach is a bit longer on the Smuggler, 460 versus 455 on the Stumpjumper medium. They both use 170 cranks, which I really like, just less pedal strikes. And then the head tube angles are about the same. So in the low position, the head tube angle of the Stumpjumper is 65 and 65 on the Smuggler. Now, one thing about the Smuggler, since we're talking about geometry, is it has a steeper seat tube angle. So 78.6 versus 76 on the Stumpjumper in the low position. And so what that does is it really allows for you to get your weight over the front more when you're climbing, which allows the front end to be more controlled. However, I didn't feel like the front end of the Stumpjumper was less controlled. So, you know, even though on paper that seems a big deal, just from what I remember about riding the Stumpjumper, it didn't feel like that much of a less capable climber. And while we're speaking about climbing, the Stumpjumper is about 1 pound to 1.5 pounds lighter than the Smuggler, and so that really helps on the climbs. It helps if you're going to use the bike for cross country. And then speaking of cross country, an advantage of the Stumpjumper is you can change the geometry with the flip chip, and that makes more of a difference than you would think. It makes a bike feel fairly decent on the cross-country trail. I wouldn't buy the bike for cross-country trails, but if you're going to use it on cross-country trails, it's nice to be able to change that geometry. So I really like that about the Stumpjumper, which you cannot do in the Smuggler. So those are the things that really make the Smuggler a bit better of a descending bike. So if your focus is more on descending, you like this travel range, which I do. I'm going back to bikes with kind of, you know, 150, maybe 140 in the front like the Smuggler, and 130 to 140 in the back. It's just, for me, the best all-around bike for riding in the mountains because I don't race enduro. But if you want a bike that's a bit more descending focused, the Smuggler's your bike. If you want a bike that's a bit more all-around focused, the Stumpjumper is your bike. Now, let's talk about a few other differences that I've noticed. The Stumpjumper uses a 780 wide bar versus an 800. I like an 800 when I'm going down rougher descents. That being said, the 780 was fine for me. I would prefer an 800. The tires on the Stumpjumper, obviously it's a fairly easy swap. It's not a super cheap swap because tires are expensive today, but the Stumpjumper tires had a soft compound, the Butcher, and I think the Purgatory is what it came with. I liked those tires for descending. It muted trail chatter. The tires had a ton of grip. It honestly made up for a little bit of the less descending capabilities of the Stumpjumper. Honestly felt like it added about 5 millimeters, maybe 10 millimeters of travel. Just, they were compliant, they were soft, they grip well, they muted trail chatter. The bad thing about them was they were really sluggish on climbing and cross-country trails. I like the Maxxis tires that come on the Smuggler. So, you know, that's just one thing that I'll mention. Now, here's a huge advantage of the Stumpjumper that I really like is the swap box. That stupid little thing is addictive because you can just throw tools in there and not have to worry about your tools. And they're lower on the bike, so the center of gravity is lower, but really just the advantage of going out for a ride, especially short ones when you don't want to bring a Camelback or hip pack and you just want to throw a water bottle in and go out for a 1 hour and a half ride. The thing's great, and I wish every one of my bikes had a swap box. So I really like that about Stumpjumper. Now let's talk about kind of the elephant in the room about these two bikes, and that is the price. So with Transition, you know, they're a little bit more, they are more of a boutique brand versus Specialized, and you see that in the price. So the Smuggler, as this version sits, is $7,300, SRAM Axis T-Type, and the most comparable bike in Specialized lineup is the Expert T-Type. I would say the Pro, but the Pro is fairly upgraded, like with EXO and also Kashima coating on the shocks, carbon rims. So the Expert model is the most comparable bike, and that's $6,000. So you're looking at a $1,300 price difference between these two bikes. That's not chump change, y'all. That's for a lot of people, that's going to be the deal breaker. But I love Transition. I love their bikes ride so well. The Stumpjumper rides well. It's going to come down to how much of a versatile bike do you want. If you want a bike don't get me wrong, the Smuggler is still very versatile. That's why I like this travel range, but it's just more focused on the descents. So if you're looking for that overall bike and you really love descending like I do, the Smuggler is your bike. So yeah, that's my just discussion of these two bikes, going from memory, because it's been a few months since I've had the Stumpjumper. But going from memory, I think that's a pretty fair comparison. Please let me know in the comments below what you think about these two bikes. If you've ridden them, if you've ridden both of them, even better, let us know your differences. And like I said before, I may try to get my hands on the Evo version of the Stumpjumper, because that looks like a pretty sweet bike also on paper. Jumping in here as I wrap up this video to remind you to please give this video a thumbs up if you like this type of content, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done that. And you can do that by clicking on the little icon below. I always forget to say this, and one of Seth's recent videos on social media reminded me of how important that is to help the YouTube algorithms, which helps us content creators for all the time and effort that we put into these videos. All right, thanks for watching, and again, drop some comments below what you think about this comparison, and I will catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.